if you could just introduce yourselves, please, and tell me more about your organization.
My name's Helen Kenny. I'm the campaign manager for Save Syria Schools. I've actually only been working with CanDo for a month now, so I'm quite new to it.
I'm Jemima Williams. I am Executive Assistant to the CEO, who's Dr. Rola Hallam. I've been working for the organisation for several years. Specifically, our work is to support frontline health workers and medics in conflict zones. So Rola is herself a doctor and a Syrian, and learnt from her medical missions that majoritively aid work was being carried out, and medical aid work was being carried out by locals, local medics, local aid workers. But in Syria, as an example, those aid workers are doing 75% of the aid work and getting less than 1% of the funding. So she created CanDo to try and directly resource these local frontliners and medics who know their communities, who know what's needed, and who are the direct line to saving children and to saving people in conflict.
And why Save Syria School? Now, Dr. Rola works in the medical field. Why the shift from medicine to education? Why the need to, for this campaign?
Twofold. One being that part of the reason she became a doctor was to make the biggest impact she could. But if you're just treating children as they come through your hospital doors and not mitigating the root cause of that when it comes to conflict, your job will never be done. So she realized through doing that it was much more important to make sure that you protect children, civil and civilians, before they come through hospital doors. Secondly, in 2013, when she was on a medical mission in Syria, a school was bombed about 8 kilometers away from her hospital, and all of these children were brought into the hospital burnt and bleeding from this incendiary weapon attack. This direct connection has been an intangible thing throughout the whole of the conflict. So she's spent a lot of time advocating against the targeting of both schools and hospitals, because that has been a military tactic, but from the regime, in order to weaken society and to terrorize civilians. Why schools? In terms of a military tactic, is because by targeting a school, you target the whole community. If children are not safe to go to school, if people are not safe to go to hospitals, the civilians are never going to feel safe. This direct attack and her treating of the patients was filmed by a BBC crew who made a documentary following her work. And 8 years later, they've created a follow-up to tell the stories of these children. And they wanted Rola to be involved with that because she was the doctor that treated these children. So the Save Syria Schools campaign came about kind of to leverage that moment of this documentary being released, but also because we have worked with Haras, who are the only Syrian-led child protection agency in Syria at the moment, really. And they have been the organization documenting attacks on schools since 2016. There are several organizations who document attacks on hospitals quite clearly, and those have been recorded throughout the conflict, but schools is trickier and has been less accurately done. So Haras have started doing this work, and they have this data on attacks on schools, as well as others, but that show that there have been over 1,000 throughout the duration of the conflict. And this, as you said, Anne-Marie, at the beginning of this conversation, this is so widely underreported. Hospitals are seen as something which has been marked throughout the conflict, not to say that that's better in any way, but schools have been completely missed. So this campaign came about kind of as a direct response to those things. And with the third element being that Haras CanDo has always worked with frontliners first. So projects are determined by the local people who say what they need. And Haras determined that the way that they thought that they could best offer protection to children was to install early warning systems in these schools, which prepare them for attack and give them 7 minutes warning if there's an aerial strike. And also to provide, that includes evacuation training for all of the staff and all the teachers, but also to provide mental health support and trauma recovery for these children who have all witnessed their schoolmates, their family members, trauma for 10 years. So those kind of factors came together to create the campaign, and why not so much a shift from schools to hospitals, because that's always been a big part of Rola's advocacy, has been to protect civilians, and schools are a big part of that. But that's very much as why, as a doctor, she's now, or she has been, trying to support all of these areas.
How much support have you received for the campaign so far?
Helen, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll answer that. So far we've got various different ways that we kind of measure the support that we're receiving. So we have a change.org petition, which is still live at the moment, which has, actually I can give you the exact amount as we speak, hold on, it's just under it's 73,500 signatures as of right this second. So you know, a huge amount of support in terms of signatures, and that basically, that change.org petition is, you know, focused on petitioning Dominic Raab to fund all of the schools in northwestern Syria to basically provide early warning systems for all of those schools, whereas the campaign is focused for us specifically on 150 of the most vulnerable schools. So we're saying, you know, we can campaign to fund these schools, but actually really what we should be doing is asking the UK government to pay what is actually a relatively small amount of money, under £1 million, to fund all of the schools that are most vulnerable in northwestern Syria. So that support is great so far, and we're continuing to kind of email and kind of push that stuff to kind of lobby the government for that as well. In terms of on the fundraising side of things, so at the moment we've got funding for 25 schools to install early warning systems and have the trauma recovery support as well. We also have some pledges from foundations for another 15 schools at this point as well. So altogether, we're looking at about 40 schools so far. And the campaign's been running for just under 3 weeks now. So, you know, we're feeling pretty positive about that. And we have also a couple of other kind of private screenings with some major donors coming up, which we're basically hoping will take us past our 150 school target followed by the end of April. So, you know, feeling quite positive about the support that we're getting from both on the kind of the political change.org side, and also from the funding and supporter side of things. And also, you know, from our perspective as well, I think we see support also as the kind of the responses that we get from people, and the words that people send through via email once they've donated, and some of the messages that are on the change.org site as well. You know, I think especially for kind of us as a team, and for Rola, in terms of the work that she does, we really count that as a huge support as well, in terms of actually hearing that people care, and that there is still that people do still want to make that difference, and to push and to support Syria, and that this has actually been a huge reminder for people about, you know, that this has been going on for 10 years, and that they I guess they needed the reminder again, but that it's kind of pushed it to the forefront of their minds, and hopefully then they'll push that forward to their friends and family as well.
Yes, as you said, it's been 10 years, and when conflict or crisis carries on for the period that it has carried on for, people tend to forget. The media gets busy. Now, unfortunately, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So those issues tend to get forgotten. Yeah. And 2013 was when Dr. Rola experienced that bombing. It's 2021. And it's still happening. It hasn't stopped. So we definitely need that support to push for these systems in place.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, I think I shouldn't say, you know, I think some of maybe we would have got even more media attention, but there's been like you say, there's been the pandemic, plus there's been so many things going on in the UK over the past few weeks that have been huge news, like the Sarah Everard stuff. And then, you know, there's been a lot of focus on kind of various and things with the new policing bill that's kind of caused all of the protests, and, you know, all of that stuff. So I think a lot of the media has been very focused on stuff that's going on in the UK, understandably, but I think that in some ways, you know, it's because that's kind of been the time that we've been kind of wanting to get more media attention. That's maybe kind of pushed it out a little bit, which that is how the media works. But obviously we want to continue to push to try and make sure that continues to get focus, and we can, you know, continue to try and push for that as well.
what do you have to say to people who say that, oh, this is just a media stunt, or it's propaganda, you're just trying to raise funds and making a big thing about an issue that may not be, they may even call it fake. And thanks to the internet, we have so much of misinformation being distributed. So sometimes you can't blame people for believing what they see or what they hear. So what do you have to, you know, kind of get rid of that misinformation and fake news, basically, that is around this very sensitive topic?
I think part of a tactic that has been used throughout this conflict is to paint it as something that's very complicated, and therefore it's something that nobody understands and that people can't access. And I think very clearly the line on this conflict is it's often called a civil war. It's not a civil war. It's an attack on civilians, a war on civilians, and it has been since the beginning. And part of the reason why there has been so much misinformation about it has been a necessity for the Assad and the Putin regimes to continue to work as they're doing, because they're contravening continually so many international humanitarian laws in order to terrorize a population of people. As regards to the actual documentary itself, claims of fakery have been made, not just against Rola, but against the BBC, against various organisations. The White Helmets have had their own share of conflict with the tragic death of their CEO for similar reasons, totally falsely proven. And I think one of the biggest things that came out of the documentary, the first one in 2013, was this claim of fakery, which the BBC put in thousands of pounds and many months of effort to host a full tribunal against, to find the claims completely false. And Rola, as an individual, and we as an organisation, have never engaged with these fake claims, because to engage with them gives them fuel. But I think what people get from listening to Rola speak, to hearing the stories, not just of her, but the frontliners who we work with Haras, with the White Helmets, with people on the ground who I speak to at least, all of the time. I think when people stop and think and understand that these are humans living in completely inhuman conditions, which are very, very stoppable, I think that comes to the fore. And part of why we're installing the early warning systems is because they create an irrefutable data log of these attacks, of where they've come from, of the planes, of all of the information that goes behind. And there is so much data collected mostly by Syrians over the last 10 years, so much data and proof of attacks in order for this accountability work to happen and continue happening.
And that, I think, is very important, because we don't have data coming out of Syria because of the conflict and the crisis. It's impossible to map, how many bombs are being dropped. And with the early warning system, we would probably have a very reliable source of information.
Sure. It's not strictly true. There is lots of data being collected and there's lots of resources being put out. Part of the problem is that the UN has a very specific system about who they consider primary sources. And in conflict zones particularly, they're often really hesitant to grant that primary source status to individuals or to organizations that are locals. But the UN at the moment has no access into Syria, so they're saying that there is no data that can be officially put forward by the UN. However, we have got several organizations, several people, several bodies, several entities who have been collecting data for a long time. Save the Children are one of the biggest aid organizations in the world. They're using data to report attacks on schools. So it's not true to say there's no data. It's just that there is not the political will to utilize it at this point.
And this, the early warning systems will be like this reliable source, and then people will have to say, okay, fine, you have this data, and we can't say, okay, it was collected from someone who is not an official source.
That's been the case. I mean, there are many examples of data collection in exactly that way, and there is lots of data being collected for accountability. Again, as I said, at the moment, the political will is not there to hold Assad or the Putin regime to account for their war crimes. There will be, but there isn't right now. So there's data that this will, of course, add to, which will be there for accountability, and which we hope is something that comes soon. we are not the only organisation for pushing for that to be the case. And yeah.
And you all are petitioning the UK government and have received a lot of support so far. Just 3 weeks into the campaign, and it looks like you have quite a good amount of support. Is there a plan to petition, say, the EU or any other government to help to expand the campaign so that it's more successful?
It's a good question. So before we began the campaign, it wasn't just a random ask of the UK government because we happen to be a British charity. That was not the reason why it's the UK government. So we conducted a theory of change research with lots of organisations. And it's not just CanDo who are running this campaign. We have several partner organisations, and we spoke to many to talk to them about their advocacy, so that our political ask is something that makes sense with work being done and that actually pushes the needle and finds the pressure point. So the lead countries in protecting education are actually, it's not the UK, it's Ireland and it's Belgium. But what we realised was that because the FCDO, so that's the Foreign Office in the UK, have already funded quite a few schools within northwest Syria, so they have some responsibility for that. They're also looking for a way particularly to balance the fact that they're withdrawing aid budget to Syria, but trying to make sure that they can show that they've made tangible impact and tangible difference. There's always this kind of balancing. So the reason why we went to the UK government was for that specific reason, that to them, this is a relatively small ask with big impact on schools that they're already invested in some way. What we will do and will continue to do, and part of our plan, which is not just CanDo, but with the other organisations we're working with, is we want to create essentially an emergency response plan to when there are attacks on schools. So in future, what the UN Security Council is saying now is that they will move, they say they will move when there are further attacks on schools. When there are no attacks on schools, they don't consider it to be a live problem. So the next attack on school, the next attack that there is on a school, we want to make sure that we have rallied with the organisational partners that we have, with the movement what we have, to then bring it back towards the UN. So it doesn't just stop with asking Dominic Raab to fund these schools, but that's the most poignant and direct way we can make tangible impact right now as schools are in danger, with a longer term political and advocacy ask, which is a combination of several organisations to move this campaign forward going for the year ahead, really.
It is a very logical way of putting things, because yes, the government has cut aid, but kind of to pacify their conscience and say, okay, we've cut aid, but we are supporting this. It kind of works like that, because it's still, we're still giving aid, but maybe not putting out the figures that. So they've cut the budget, but they're still supporting, they're still giving something for early warning systems. We hope that that is fulfilled. But it's quite cruel to wait for an attack and then, say, okay, fine, now we will do something about it.
To be clear, that's why we're fundraising for the 150 most urgently, schools most in danger now. So we're moving because, as we've just discussed, the UN and governments are far too slow. This has been the rhetoric for the whole time, is we will move when there's policy change from big organisations. The reason why CanDo exists is because whilst everybody's waiting for bureaucracy and policy to change, children on the ground are being hurt, and the nurses and the medics and the aid workers are treating them anyway. So the reason why we're moving and why this is a public fundraising ask, why we have a petition, why we're moving the way we are, is because we need to, because this is urgent. The last attack on the school was last month on the 20th of March.
So
it's happening anyway, and so we need to.
Why wait to implement or to create a policy when it's happened? Just take Syria for an example. It's happened for 10 years. What more evidence do you need? It's happened.
That's what we feel, and that's why we exist, and that's why we keep moving. But that's also particularly why CanDo, as you said, is an organisation founded by a doctor. So we work very much in health, and our projects are health led, but that's why we also campaign, that's why we also push for political ask, that's why we also push advocacy, because we've been treating the wounds for 10 years. Rola particularly, as a Syrian, has been treating the wounds for 10 years, and will continue to advocate and will continue to be a push and a campaigner, as she has done since 2012, for that exact reason. but it has to, at the moment, sadly, it's both. It's us on the ground and local frontliners on the ground treating the symptoms, and we're trying our best to treat the causes as well.
It
can be frustrating.
It is, because y'all can see what is happening, and you should have a plan in place, but political will is so slow that the plan takes very long to get implemented, and by that time you'll have more casualties, more tragedy.
I think that speaks to exactly the urgency of this campaign and why it's
It
been.
could have been avoided, but they are so slow moving that by the time the policy is actually in place, it's a little late, or very late.
There was a report done in 2016 by a UK think tank called the ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, who called the aid industry inefficient, costly, and not fit for purpose. And we certainly think that that's true, and that's part of why CanDo was founded. If you have a system which can't actually solve the problems, then the system doesn't work.
No, it is a complicated situation, but sitting back and saying, okay, fine, we'll think about a plan and then maybe implement it. It's time to take action. It's not time to make plans.
Yes. That's very much the voice of this campaign, I think.
Thank you for talking to me and explaining your campaign, explaining what you do. And I wish you all the best with the campaign. I hope you get the support you are asking for.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
And gain a further amount to help more children in Syria.